What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. It's no secret that any fandom has its vocal detractors. Some people may dismiss it as haters trying to spoil everyone's fun, but I disagree. I think a good portion of criticism can come from actual fans who simply want the thing they love to be better, and Pokémon is no exception. So today I wanted to go through some of the most controversial opinions people have, not for the sake of being inflammatory or provocative, but because they sincerely hold these beliefs, and I'll start. I think DLC for Pokémon games is a mistake, or at least the way they've been handling them, and that they should go back to third games. They never will, but I think a post-launch add-on to the main game, instead of a fully created separate version, makes for an overall worse product, and you have to pay extra for it. Seriously, it's an extra 50% increase in price to make a bad game decent. Now you might say that at least you don't have to buy two versions of the same game, but you'd still be getting the same product a year later anyway. The game will not be finished until at least a year after launch, so you can buy the beta now and play a buggy version of it until then, where you then get to pay more, or you could just wait for a full third version at regular cost, like back in the day. Just because you don't have the self-control or patience to wait doesn't mean that you can gaslight me into thinking that this is somehow a better deal. Not to mention the preservation issues that it causes. Third games are still some of the most beloved fan favorites in franchise history, but now anybody in the future buying a base copy of Sword or Shield or Scarlet or Violet will likely not be getting the full experience. And when the Switch servers shut down, there will be no way to ever get it back. But that's just my opinion. I'm far from the only Pokémon fan who people would think is off their rocker, so let's see what viewers like you have to say, like the ones that agree with my initial premise. Or this one, specifically, by Austin Velez 9387, saying, "It gives you a chance to use a whole new starter and team, which is a huge reason that I loved third versions, because they make more than 6 Pokémon a generation. I usually want to use more Pokémon than I have room for, so providing another excuse to use them, with a tweaked story and new features, sounds like a perfect win-win on all counts." Now this comment from Canal Champlu says, "Coming back to old games really shows that the lack of grinding from the new titles are a good step in the right direction for the franchise, that levels are not making the games easier, it's other things like the enemies' movesets that need to be changed." And I agree, and I don't. I don't think that grinding was inherently the problem, rather it's grinding with underpowered normal type attacks that gets ridiculous, because older games have utterly horrible move pools, and they never learned anything good until like level 45 or something ridiculous. So that's what made it rough, but I do agree that enemy movesets could improve. And it's funny because you can find the opposite of most any topic with the likes of Compulsive, who says, "Grinding is one of the most fun parts of the Pokémon games, and I hate that the newer games are devoid of it. They are far too easy and it bores me to tears." So I guess you can have supporters on both sides of just about any issue. There are some simple ideas that people have, like Gravity is Falling, who says, "Every gen should get a new battle mechanic and previous gimmicks should never return. You lost me, but then you got me back." I firmly believe the games do not need gimmicks to be fun or to sell, or whatever the reason is they keep using them, but I wholeheartedly agree that if they do insist on repeating this trend, that they should be exclusive. It would probably crash the game outright to just use them all at once anyway, but it would crowd out any region to use Megas and Z-moves and Terastallizing altogether. Sam Gould 3892 says, "I think that Fione has a better design than Manaphy. And I know Manaphy is just a better Fione, but I just prefer Fione." And that one is actually very spicy. Fione is one of the most reviled Pokemon I can think of, but I can actually kind of see what they mean. Its shape is more unique than Manaphy, who just kind of copies the past Pixie Pokemon, but Fione more closely resembles its origins. I think the main thing holding it back is the blue, which makes it look more boring compared to Manaphy's yellow, but design-wise, yeah, I can see where you're coming from. UberCow6611 says, "Maybe we were too hard on Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. It's definitely a bad remake due to the standards set by the other remakes that it failed to meet, but it's still a good game. It might be lacking in content from Platinum, but it's still a step up from regular Diamond and Pearl in its own ways. And I think it's fair to say that in a vacuum, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl would not be so hated. Maybe Distance will be kind to these remakes, or maybe we'll just have to wait until the kids grow up and say, 'That was my first Pokemon game.' But I do think that they are far from the worst Pokemon games ever. Where I disagree is them beating the original Diamond and Pearl, because that would be quite absurd. In fact, the homie Lou says BDSP's unceremonious launch, plus the pulling of neat side features like Capture the Flag, Chatter, classic contests, unknown seals, etc., put a false memory in some people that the base Diamond and Pearl are bad. Not like mediocre, but bad. Despite the flaws everyone points out, Platinum would never have been a great game unless its foundation was at least decently solid. And I completely agree. I find it some serious revisionist history to say that the original Gen 4 games were bad. Slow and lack of fire types does not outweigh all of the great steps forward that the first games on the DS took, and the leaps in quality from the Game Boy Advance cannot be overstated. There is a reason that Diamond and Pearl were the third best-selling games for the next 15 years, and to judge them as plain awful because the remakes didn't include Platinum content is just disingenuous. My Kalos Maniac says, Silent and Clement are objectively better than Brock. Oh man, that is a bold claim. I could maybe actually see a good case for Clement because he not only has a good relationship with all of his Pokémon, but also built a whole autonomous robot, which he could program to do just about anything Brock could, but I don't know about Silent. Sure, he could probably cook better than Brock, but I don't think he's quite as knowledgeable about everything the way Brock was for being a Pokémon breeder, so maybe half and half, I'd say. Slade Valen 2120 says, Fairy is an unnecessary type and Gen 5's roster of new Pokémon is overrated. Those are two very different topics, but we'll cover Fairy first. I don't think that's the case. Dragon was way too dominant, so introducing a counter to it was on the table. I might agree that Fairy wasn't balanced properly to be immune to Dragon, and Bug certainly didn't need another type to resist it, but to say that the type shouldn't exist is false just for the fact that Steel and Poison now have actual offensive uses. As for the Gen 5 roster, I still think most people point out all of the weird and poorly made ones, so I wouldn't say that the whole of the new Pokémon are overrated. As for the games themselves, I think we have reached that point where people are starting to put Black and White on a pedestal. Mr. Super Smash 93 is a man after my own heart, saying Z-moves and Gigantamax are better than Mega Evolution, and I endorse this fully. Well, maybe not Gigantamax specifically, but Dynamaxing and Z-moves can be used by every Pokémon, whereas Megas were mostly the already cool favorite ones. Same with Terastallizing too, which is why it's my favorite gimmick to date. I know that none of them will stick around, but Megas were far too exclusive, while the others shared the glory with even the lower level unevolved Pokémon, so you don't have to beat the game before you can use the feature. Fogy Squatch says, I do not like regional variants. Take Alolan Sandshrew, for instance. They should have given it its own Pokédex number and just called it Snowshrew. Its Pokédex entry could even reference the fact that it's related to Sandshrew. Convergent evolutions like Toadscool are the regions done right. So I don't disagree that convergent Pokémon are interesting, like Toadscool, as you mentioned, but I disagree that variants should never have existed. Take Wiglet, for instance. People complained that it was totally a Diglett, but just wouldn't admit to it. Or even the Paradox Pokémon. They bloated the roster well past 1,000, leaving fans to wonder, how is this thing just not a form of Hariyama? So yes, Snowshrew would be cool, but whenever Digimon creates a technically different species by ripping off an existing one, people point to it as a sign of creative bankruptcy. So Pokémon filling a new game with blatant copies of their past work would have enraged fans if the regional forms had not softened the blow for them first. Aiden Boyarsky says Typhlosion's design sucks. It's a bigger and uglier Quilava. Agreed, 100%. Quilava is in every way a superior design to its evolution, in either form. The blue over the whole top of its face is such a simple touch, but it makes a huge difference. And the flame mohawk is perfect and just loses so much character when turning sideways for Typhlosion. I never really understood why Typhlosion was the most popular in Johto when it gets more boring after the rad quadruped Quilava stage. Supersonic 1014 echoes my earlier point with, Pokémon Black 2 and White 2 are some of the most overhyped and overrated games in the franchise to me. It really feels like a step down in just about everything Black and White did. It had a worse story, Team Plasma shed everything that made them interesting, and just turned them into Evil Team number 4098. It's nowhere near as replayable due to said story being way more drawn out and adding required tutorials for side modes that no one cares about. Now, this is from someone who has played Black and White 2 multiple times to get those free shiny dragons at the end, but they're so right, man. Mostly about the replayability part, because they nailed it with a dig at Pokestar Studios. It is so daunting to slog through that section of the early game every time you replay it, and they're right about Team Plasma too, because in the first games they at least pretended to care about freeing Pokemon, but that was all lost by the time Colress was flying around an ice sailboat. I don't know if I would say that the sequels are an all-around worse version of the originals, but this is actually a good take by Supersonic. R.A.J. Kivas says, I think the physical special split was a mistake. Requiring mixed attackers to have both stats was a good thing, but Dark and Dragon should be physical and Ghost and Fairy should be special. Oh man, I don't know about this one. I mean, mixed attackers now don't need equal stats in both fields to be able to pull off surprising actions, just slightly more investment than a one-trick pony. Requiring mixed attackers to have both stats was a good thing. I don't really know what they mean by that, because before the split you didn't need both stats, since they were always just one or the other, but I do agree that Ghost should have never been physical. I don't even know why that happened. That makes even less sense than Flittle evolving into Espathra. Mr. Thinmint2848 says, my hot take, Legends Arceus is overrated, terrible, and a snooze fest. It's my least favorite mainline game. Well, I did ask for hot takes, and you certainly delivered. Overrated, I could maybe see an argument for, but terrible and a snooze fest? I just have to ask, were you one of those people that followed the story at every single beat? Because as soon as I was able, I ran away and explored on my own, and I had a blast. So if you immediately run to every waypoint that they told you to go to, of course you're not going to have fun. But hey, at least you admitted that it is a mainline game, so I'll take that. And I'll just say that I don't care for Thin Mints either, so I guess we're even. The great name Kawagamon Tamer says Greninja is totally uncreative and disgusting. If it weren't tricked out with a great concoction of stats, broken ability, and moves, no one would care about it. They pushed it on people to like because they got to feel skilled while actually just using something OP. It is so gross that it uses a tongue scarf, which would have made it even more disdained than Licky Licky had it not been so heavily shielded for by the game design. Absolutely, you nailed it. Greninja's popularity never even had a chance to be organic because before the games even came out, they were pushing it in every way possible. I just picked up the game and saw a weird ninja that didn't really look like it came from Froakie at all, but everyone else fell for the power fantasy of getting to obliterate everything because they decided Greninja should be on top from the start. Basically, pick a better favorite Pokemon, people. Spooky8662 says set mode should be on by default. Switch should be the baby mode that you have to opt in for. This one is just a flat no. It doesn't sound like there's any logic here other than you dislike people who don't play the game the way you do, but currently the ability to change the mode is in the options menu, so you can just turn it on whenever you want instead of inconveniencing the vast majority of people who still like and want to play with the Switch mode on. The Apriltron says Umbreon is the worst evolution. Well, they didn't give a counter to what they think the best is, so I can't contrast them. However, I will just say a glow-in-the-dark, poisonous sweat, physical wall of a sleek canine creature doesn't really sound like the worst of anything to me, so I can't agree on this one. Mr. Brewski Drewski says, my controversial pick is that the Alola games are better than Hoenn. I started with Pokemon Blue that I got for my birthday. Then when Alpha Sapphire came out, I played through it for a bit, but I didn't get around to finishing it. Then that same year, I got Pokemon Sun for Christmas. Now that game really got me into Pokemon, and I still hold that region in high regard. As a side note, I think Popplio is the best of the three. This is interesting because I quite like Oros, but I did play the original Hoenn games, so maybe that comparison is part of why I enjoyed the remake so much. And even with your limited Pokemon exposure, you could still tell that Alola was intentionally different with the trials and totems and Z-moves, and Hoenn is perhaps the most apt comparison because it was the closest that we had to an island chain with clear tropical influences before. But I think it's unquestionable that Alola did that theming much better. As for Popplio being the best, sorry, but either version of Decidueye is going to beat it out in my book. Geodude Spits Facts says, they should ditch the evil team thing and focus on an actual antagonist with a compelling story that's not tied to any organization. Also, they should keep the main series focused on kids and have a spin-off series with more mature themes. Yeah, this is pretty on the money. The evil teams haven't even been that evil for like a decade now, so the trope is totally played out and overly predictable. So I agree. A singular antagonist could be quite scary, like think of a malicious version of N that could be terrifying and easily capture a story for a whole game. Also, I'll sign on to the second part as well and say that the mainline games should not change their core audience of children. And finally, Daniel Cove 2949 says, they can stop making new Pokémon, at least an entire generation's worth. Keep making new games with new regions and stories, just have a different mix of existing Pokémon that is unique to that climate and environment. Maybe add some new inspired designs as needed, but no more filler or duplicates that are a result of padding out the dex numbers for a new region. So this is an interesting point, but I kind of agree. I know that I just said mainline Pokémon shouldn't change, but they can make a cool story with existing Pokémon in a new place for a while without making any new actual Pokémon. Instead of a DLC, they could have made Kitakami a whole new game. Just give it a real map to work with, and then it would make a great Pokémon Teal version, because it has nothing in common with the Paldea region anyway. So why waste all that time developing a new place and culture, and the mix of past Pokémon that should be there just to shove it hastily into Scarlet and Violet? This could have been a brand new game next year sometime, even without the legendary Pokémon added at all. I honestly think this is the future of Pokémon, in making several different kinds of games with existing assets but new settings and stories. We don't need 60 to 120 new pocket monsters every 3 years, and honestly we could probably get away with a new generation every 4 years or more at that point, if we could find a way to make good Pokemon games in the meantime with existing features. But I guess that could make them slightly less money, so they're never going to do it anyway. These are far from the only comments listed on that post that I made, so head over to the community tab to check those out, but I did enjoy looking at what other people think in the Pokemon fandom and discussing our more divisive ideas. So what are your most controversial Pokemon opinions? Did you actually like the DLC? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded.